Section 27 of the works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Holly Mansfield. The works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 2. Speech on Mr. Fox's East India Bill, December 1st, 1783, Part 4. It is only to complete the view I proposed of the conduct of the company with regard to the dependent provinces that I shall say anything at all of the Carnatic, which is the scene, if possible, of greater disorder than the northern provinces. Perhaps it were better to say of this centre and metropolis of abuse, whence all the rest in India and in England diverge, from whence they are fed and methodized, what was said of Carthage. De Carthagina satius est celera quam parum dicere. This country, in all its denominations, is about 46,000 square miles. It may be affirmed universally that not one person of substance or property, landed, commercial, or moneyed, excepting 2 or 3 bankers who are necessary deposits and distributors of the general spoil, is left in all that region. In that country the moisture, the bounty of heaven, is given but at a certain season. Before the era of our influence, the industry of man carefully husbanded that gift of God. The gentoos preserved with a provident and religious care the precious deposit of the periodical rain in reservoirs, many of them works of royal grandeur, and from these, as occasion demanded, they fructified the whole country. To maintain these reservoirs, and to keep up an annual advance to the cultivators for seed and cattle, formed a principal object of the piety and policy of the priests and rulers of the gentoo religion. This object required a command of money, and there was no polum or castle which in the happy days of the Carnatic was without some hoard of treasure, by which the governors were enabled to combat with the irregularity of the seasons, and to resist or buy off the invasion of an enemy. In all the cities were multitudes of merchants and bankers, for all occasions of moneyed assistance, and on the other hand the native princes were in condition to obtain credit from them. The manufacturer was paid by the return of commodities or by imported money, and not, as at present, in the taxes that had been originally exacted from his industry. In aid of casual distress, the country was full of chultries, which were inns and hospitals where the traveller and the poor were relieved. All ranks of people had their place in the public concern, and their share in the common stock and common prosperity. But the chartered rights of men and the right which it was thought proper to set up in the Nabob of Arcot introduced a new system. It was their policy to consider hoards of money as crimes, to regard moderate rents as frauds on the sovereign, and to view in the lesser princes any claim of exemption from more than settled tribute as an act of rebellion. Accordingly, all the castles were, one after the other, plundered and destroyed. The native princes were expelled, the hospitals fell to ruin, the reservoirs of water went to decay, the merchants, bankers, and manufacturers disappeared, and sterility, indigence, and depopulation overspread the face of these once flourishing provinces. The company was very early sensible of these mischiefs and of their true cause. They gave precise orders, quote, that the native princes, called polygars, should not be extirpated, end quote. Quote, the rebellion, end quote, so they choose to call it, quote, of the polygars may, they fear, with too much justice be attributed to the maladministration of the nabob's collectors, end quote. Quote, they observe with concern that their troops have been put to disagreeable services, end quote. They might have used a stronger expression without impropriety, but they make amends in another place. Speaking of the polygars, the directors say that, quote, it was repugnant to humanity to force them to such dreadful extremities as they underwent, end quote. That some examples of severity might be necessary, quote, when they fell into the nabob's hands, end quote, and not by the destruction of the country, quote, that they fear his government is none of the mildest, and that there is great oppression in collecting his revenues, end quote. They state that the wars in which he has involved the Carnatic has been a cause of distress, quote, that those distresses have certainly been great, but those by the nabob's oppressions they believe to be greater than all, end quote. Pray, sir, attend to the reason for their opinion that the government of this their instrument is more calamitous to the country than the ravages of war, because, say they, his oppressions are, quote, without intermission, the others are temporary, by all which oppressions we believe the nabob has great wealth in store, end quote. From this store neither he nor they could derive any advantage whatsoever upon the invasion of Hyder Ali in the hour of their greatest calamity and dismay. It is now proper to compare these declarations with the company's conduct. The principal reason which they assigned against the extirpation of the polygars was that the weavers were protected in their fortresses. They might have added that the company itself, which stung them to death, had been warmed in the bosom of these unfortunate princes, for on the taking of the Madras by the French, it was in their hospitable columns that most of the inhabitants found refuge and protection. But notwithstanding all these orders, reasons, and declarations, they at length gave an indirect sanction, and permitted the use of a very direct and irresistible force, to measures which they had over and over again declared to be false policy, cruel, inhuman, and oppressive. Having, however, forgot all attention to the princes and the people, they remembered that they had some sort of interest in the trade of the country, and it is a matter of curiosity to observe the protection which they afforded to this their natural object. Full of anxious cares on this head, they direct, quote, that in reducing the polygars, they, their servants, were to be cautious not to deprive the weavers and manufacturers of the protection they often met within the strongholds of the polygar countries. End quote. And they write to their instrument, the Nabob of Arcot, concerning these poor people in a most pathetic strain. Quote, "We entreat your excellency," end quote, say they, quote, "in particular to make the manufacturers the objects of your tenderest care, particularly when you root out the polygars. You do not deprive the weavers of the protection they enjoyed under them." End quote. When they root out the protectors in favour of the oppressor, they show themselves religiously cautious of the rights of the protected. When they extirpate the shepherd and the shepherd's dog, they piously recommend the helpless flock to the mercy, and even to the tenderest care of the wolf. This is the uniform strain of their policy, strictly forbidding, and at the same time strenuously encouraging and enforcing, every measure that can ruin and desolate the country committed to their charge. After giving the company's idea of the government of this their instrument, it may appear singular, but it is perfectly consistent with their system, that besides wasting time for him at two different times, the most exquisite spot upon the earth, Tanjore, and all the adjacent countries, they have even voluntarily put their own territory, that is, a large and fine country adjacent to Madras, called their Jagir, wholly out of their protection, and have continued to farm their subjects, and their duties towards these subjects, to that very Nabob whom they themselves constantly represent as an habitual depressor and a relentless tyrant. This they have done without any pretence of ignorance of the objects of oppression for which this prince has thought fit to become their renter, for he has again and again told them that it is for the sole purpose of exercising authority he holds the Jagir lands, and he affirms, and I believe with truth, that he pays more for that territory than the revenues yield. This deficiency he must make up from his other territories, and thus, in order to furnish the means of oppressing one part of the Carnatic, he is led to oppress all the rest. The House perceives that the livery of the company's government is uniform. I have described the condition of the countries indirectly, but most substantially under the company's authority. And now I ask whether with this map of misgovernment before me I can suppose myself bound by my vote to continue, upon any principles of pretended public faith, the management of these countries in those hands. If I kept such a faith, which in reality is no better than a fides latronum, with what is called the company, I must break the faith, the covenant, the solemn, original, indispensable oath in which I am bound by the eternal frame and constitution of things to the whole human race. As I have dwelt so long on these who are indirectly under the company's administration, I will endeavour to be a little shorter upon the countries immediately under this charter government. These are the Bengal provinces. The condition of these provinces is pretty fully detailed in the 6th and 9th reports and in their appendixes. I will select only such principles and instances as are broad and general. To your own thoughts I shall leave it, to furnish the detail of oppressions involved in them. I shall state to you as shortly as I am able the conduct of the company. First, towards the landed interests, next the commercial interests, thirdly the native government, and lastly to their own government. Bengal, and the provinces that are united to it, are larger than the kingdom of France, and once contained, as France does contain, a great and independent landed interest, composed of princes, of great lords, of a numerous nobility and gentry, of freeholders, of lower tenants, of religious communities, and public foundations. So early as 1769, the company's servants perceived the decay into which these provinces had fallen under the English administration, and they made a strong representation upon this decay and what they apprehended to be the causes of it. Soon after this representation, Mr. Hastings became president of Bengal. Instead of administering a remedy to this melancholy disorder upon the heels of a dreadful famine in the year 1772, the succour which the new president and the council lent to this afflicted nation was, shall I be believed in relating it, the landed interest of a whole kingdom, of a kingdom to be compared to France, was set up to public auction. They set up, Mr. Hastings set up, the whole nobility, gentry, and freeholders to the highest bidder, No preference was given to the ancient proprietors. They must bid against every usurer, every temporary adventurer, every jobber and schemer, every servant of every European, or they were obliged to content themselves, in lieu of their extensive domains, with their house, and such a pension as the state auctioneers thought fit to assign. In this general calamity, several of the first nobility thought, and in all appearance justly, that they had better submit to the necessity of this pension than continue, under the name of the zemindars, the objects and instruments of a system by which they ruined their tenants and were ruined themselves. Another reform has since come upon the back of the first, and a pension having been assigned to these unhappy persons in lieu of their hereditary lands, a new scheme of economy has taken place and deprived them of that pension. The menial servants of Englishmen, persons, to use the emphatical phrase of a ruined and patient Eastern chief, quote, whose fathers they would not have set with the dogs of their flock, end quote, entered into their patrimonial lands. Mr. Hastings's Banyan was after this auction found possessed of territories yielding a rent of £140,000 a year. Such a universal prescription upon any pretence has few examples. Such a prescription without even a pretence of delinquency has none. It stands by itself. It stands as a monument to astonish the imagination, to confound the reason of mankind. I confess to you, when I first came to know of this business in its true nature and extent, my surprise did a little suspend my indignation. I was in a manner stupefied by the desperate boldness of a few obscure young men, a power of which they saw neither the purposes nor the limits, tossed about, subverted and tore to pieces, as if it were in the gambols of a boyish unluckiness and malice, the most established rights, and the most ancient and most revered institutions of ages and nations. Sir, I will not now trouble you with any detail with regard to what they have since done with these same lands and landholders, only to inform you that nothing has been suffered to settle for 2 seasons together upon any basis, and that the levity and inconstancy of these mock legislators were not the least afflicting parts of the oppressions suffered under their usurpation, nor will anything give stability to the property of the natives, but an administration in England at once protecting and stable. The country sustains almost every year the miseries of a revolution. At present, all is uncertainty, misery, and confusion. There is to be found through these vast regions no longer one landed man who is a resource for voluntary aid or an object for particular rapine. Some of them were not long since great princes. They possessed treasures, they levied armies. There was a zemindar in Bengal, I forget his name, that, on the threat of an invasion, supplied the Subar of these provinces with the loan of £1,000,000 sterling. The family at this day wants credit for a breakfast at the bazaar. I shall now say a word or two on the Company's care of the commercial interest of those kingdoms. As it appears in the reports that persons in the highest stations in Bengal have adopted as a fixed plan of policy the destruction of all intermediate dealers between the Company and the manufacturer, native merchants have disappeared of course. The spoil of the revenues is the sole capital which purchases the produce and manufactures, and through 3 or 4 foreign companies transmits the official gains of individuals to Europe. No other commerce has an existence in Bengal. The transport of its plunder is the only traffic of the country. I wish to refer you to the appendix of the 9th report for a full account of the manner in which the Company have protected the commercial interests of their dominions in the East. As to the native government and the administration of justice, it subsisted in a poor tottering manner for some years. In the year 1781 a total revolution took place in that establishment. In one of the usual freaks of legislation of the Council of Bengal, the whole criminal jurisdiction of these courts, called the Fauj de Rejudicature, exercised till then by the principal Mussulman, was in one day, without notice, without consultation with the magistrates or the people there, and without communication with the directors or ministers here, totally subverted. A new institution took place, by which this jurisdiction was divided between certain English servants of the Company and the gentoo zemindars of the country, the latter of whom never petitioned for it, nor, for aught that appears, ever desired this boon, but its natural use was made of it. It was made a pretence for new extortions of money. The natives had, however, one consolation in the ruin of their judicature. They soon saw that it fared no better with the English government itself. That, too, after destroying every other, came to its period. This revolution may well be rated for a most daring act, even among the extraordinary things that have been doing in Bengal since our unhappy acquisition of the means of so much mischief. An establishment of English government for civil justice and for the collection of revenue was planned and executed by the President and Council of Bengal, subject to the pleasure of the directors, in the year 1772. According to this plan, the country was divided into 6 districts, or provinces. In each of these was established a provincial council which administered the revenue, and of that council one member by monthly rotation presided in the courts of civil resort, with an appeal to the council of the province and thence to Calcutta. In this system, whether in other respects good or evil, there were some capital advantages. There was, in the very number of persons in each provincial council, authority, communication, mutual check, and control. They were obliged on their minutes of consultation to enter their reasons and dissents, so that a man of diligence, of research, and tolerable sagacity sitting in London might from these materials be enabled to form some judgment of the spirit of what was going on the furthest banks of the Ganges and Brahmaputra. The Court of Directors so far ratified this establishment, which was consonant enough to their general plan of government, that they gave precise orders that no alteration should be made in it without their consent. So far from being apprised of any design against this constitution, they had reason to conceive that on trial it had been more and more approved by their Council General, at least by the Governor General who had planned it. At the time of the Revolution, the Council General was nominally in 2 persons, virtually in 1. At that time, measures of an arduous and critical nature ought to have been forborne, even if to the fullest counsel this specific measure had not been prohibited by the superior authority. It was in this very situation that one man had the hardiness to conceive and the temerity to execute a total revolution in the form and the persons composing the government of a great kingdom. Without any previous step, at one stroke, the whole constitution of Bengal, civil and criminal, was swept away. The councillors were recalled from their provinces, upwards of 50 of the principal offers of government were turned out of employ, and rendered dependent on Mr. Hastings for their immediate subsistence, and for all hope of future provision. The chief of each council and one European collector of revenue was left in each province. But here, sir, you may imagine a new government of some permanent description was established in the place of that which had been thus suddenly overturned. No such thing. Lest these chiefs without councils should be conceived to form the ground plan of some future government, it was publicly declared that their continuance was only temporary and permissive. The whole subordinate British administration of revenue was then vested in a committee in Calcutta, all creatures of the Governor General, and the provincial management under the permissive chief was delivered over to native officers. But that the revolution and the purposes of the revolution might be complete, to this committee were delegated not only the functions of all the inferior, but, what will surprise the House, those of the supreme administration of revenue also. Hitherto, the Governor General and Council had, in their revenue department, administered the finances of those kingdoms. By the new scheme they are delegated to this committee, who are only to report their proceedings for approbation. The key to the whole transaction is given in one of the instructions to the committee, quote, that it is not necessary that they should enter dissents. End quote. By this means, the ancient plan of the company's administration was destroyed, but the plan of concealment was perfected. To that moment, the accounts of the revenues were tolerably clear, or at least means were furnished for inquiries, by which they might be rendered satisfactory. In the obscure and silent gulf of this committee, everything is now buried. The thickest shades of night surround all their transactions. No effectual means of detecting fraud, mismanagement, or misrepresentation exist. The directors who have dared to talk with such confidence on their revenues know nothing about them. What used to fill volumes is now comprised under a few dry heads on a sheet of paper. The natives, a people habitually made to concealment, are the chief managers of the revenue throughout the provinces. I mean by natives such wretches as your rulers select out of them as most fitted for their purposes. As a proper keystone to bind the arch, a native, one Gunga Govind Singh, a man turned out of his employment by Sir John Clavering for malversation in office, is made the corresponding secretary and indeed the great moving principle of their new board. As the whole revenue and civil administration was thus subverted and a clandestine government substituted in the place of it, the judicial institution underwent a like revolution. In 1772 there had been 6 courts formed out of the 6 provincial councils. 18 new ones are appointed in their place, with each a judge taken from the junior servants of the company. To maintain these 18 courts, a tax is levied on the sums in litigation of 2 1/2% on the great, and of 5% on the less. This money is all drawn from the provinces to Calcutta. The Chief Justice, the same who stays in defiance of a vote of this House and of His Majesty's recall, is appointed at once the treasurer and disposer of these taxes, levied without any sort of authority from the company, from the Crown, or from Parliament. In effect, sir, every legal, regular authority in matters of revenue, of political administration, of criminal law, of civil law, in many of the most essential parts of military discipline, is laid level with the ground, and an oppressive, irregular, capricious, unsteady, rapacious, and peculating despotism, with a direct disavowal of obedience to any authority at home, and without any fixed maxim, principle, or rule of proceeding to guide them in India, is at present the state of your charter government over great kingdoms. As the company has made use of their trust, I should ill discharge mine if I refused to give my most cheerful vote for the redress of these abuses, by putting the affairs of so large and valuable a part of the interests of this nation and of mankind into some steady hands, possessing the confidence and assured support of this House until they can be restored to regularity, order, and consistency. I have touched the heads of some of the grievances of the people and the abuses of government, but I hope and trust you will give me credit when I faithfully assure you that I have not mentioned 1/4 part of what has come to my knowledge in your committee, and further I have full reason to believe that not 1/4 part of the abuses are come to my knowledge, by that or by any other means. Pray consider what I have said only as an index to direct you in your inquiries. If this then, sir, has been the use made of the trust of political powers, internal and external, given by you in the Charter, the next thing to be seen is the conduct of the company with regard to the commercial trust, and here I will make a fair offer. If it can be proved that they have acted wisely, prudently, and frugally as merchants, I shall pass by the whole mass of their enormities as statesmen. That they have not done this, their present condition is proof sufficient. Their distresses are said to be owing to their wars. This is not wholly true, but if it were, is not that readiness to engage in wars which distinguishes them, and for which the Committee of Secrecy has so branded their politics, founded on the falsest principles of mercantile speculation? The principle of buying cheap and selling dear is the first, the greatest foundation of mercantile dealing. Have they ever attended to this principle? Nay, for years have they not actually authorized in their servants a total indifference as to the prices they were to pay? A great deal of strictness in driving bargains for whatever we contract is another of the principles of mercantile policy. Try the company by that test. Look at the contracts that are made for them. Is the company so much as a good commissary to their own armies? I engage to select for you out of the innumerable mass of their dealings, all conducted very nearly alike, one contract only the excessive profits on which, during a short term, would pay the whole of their year's dividend. I shall undertake to show that upon 2 others the inordinate profits given, with the losses incurred in order to secure those profits, would pay a year's dividend more. It is a third property of trading men to see that their clerks do not divert the dealings of the master to their own benefit. It was the other day only, when their governor and council taxed the company's investment with a sum of £50,000 as an inducement to persuade only 7 members of their Board of Trade to give their honour that they would abstain from such profits upon that investment, as they must have violated their oaths if they had made at all. It is a 4th quality of a merchant to be exact in his accounts. What will be thought when you have fully before you the mode of accounting made use of in the Treasury of Bengal? I hope you will have it soon. With regard to one of their agencies, when it came to the material part, the prime cost of the goods on which a commission of 15% was allowed, to the astonishment of the factory to whom the commodities were sent, the Accountant General reports that he did not think himself authorized to call for vouchers relative to this and other particulars, because the agent was upon his honor with regard to them. Any principle of account upon honour seems to be regularly established in their dealings and their treasury, which in reality amounts to an entire annihilation of the principle of all accounts. It is a 5th property of a merchant, who does not mediate a fraudulent bankruptcy, to calculate his probable profits upon the money he takes up to vest in business. Did the company, when they bought goods on bonds bearing 8% interest, at 10 and even 20% discount, even ask themselves a question concerning the possibility of advantage from dealing on these terms? The last quality of a merchant I shall advert to is the taking care to be properly prepared, in cash or goods in the ordinary course of sale, for the bills which are drawn on them. Now I ask whether they have ever calculated the clear produce of any given sales, to make them tally with the 4 million of bills which are come and coming upon them, so as at the proper periods to enable the one to liquidate the other? No, they have not. They are now obliged to borrow money of their own servants to purchase their investment. The servants stipulate 5% on the capital they advance, if their bills should not be paid at the time when they become due, and the value of the rupee on which they charge this interest is taken at 2 shillings and a penny. Has the company ever troubled themselves to inquire whether their sales can bear the payment of that interest, and at that rate of exchange? Have they once considered the dilemma in which they are placed, the ruin of their credit in the East Indies if they refuse the bills, the ruin of their credit and existence in England if they accept them? Indeed, no trace of equitable government is found in their politics, not one trace of commercial principle in their mercantile dealing, and hence is the deepest and maturest wisdom of Parliament demanded, and the best resources of this kingdom must be strained to restore them. That is, to restore the countries destroyed by the misconduct of the company, and to restore the company itself, ruined by the consequences of their plans for destroying what they were bound to preserve. I required, if you remember at my outset, a proof that these abuses were habitual, but surely this is not necessary for me to consider as a separate head, because I trust I have made it evident beyond a doubt, in considering the abuses themselves, that they are regular, permanent, and systematical. I am now come to my last condition, without which, for one, I will never readily lend my hand to the destruction of any established government, which is, that in its present state the government of the East India Company is absolutely incorrigible. Of this great truth I think there can be little doubt, after all that has appeared in this House. It is so very clear that I must consider the leaving of any power in their hands, and the determined resolution to continue and countenance every mode and every degree of peculation, oppression, and tyranny to be one and the same thing. I look upon that body incorrigible from the fullest consideration both of their uniform conduct and their present real and virtual constitution. If they had not been constantly apprised of all the enormities committed in India under their authority, if this state of things had been as much a discovery to them as it was to many of us, we might flatter ourselves that the detection of the abuses would lead to their reformation. I will go further. If the Court of Directors had not uniformly condemned every act which this House or any of its committees had condemned, if the language in which they expressed their disapprobation against enormities, and their authors had not been much more vehement and indignant than any ever used in this House, I should entertain some hopes. If they had not, on the other hand, as uniformly commended all their servants who had done their duty and obeyed their orders as they had heavily censured those who rebelled, I might say, these people have been in an error, and when they are sensible of it they will mend. But when I reflect on the uniformity of their support to the objects of their uniform censure, and the state of insignificance and disgrace to which all of those have been reduced whom they approved, and that even utter ruin and premature death have been among the fruits of their favour, I must be convinced that in this case, as in all others, hypocrisy is the only vice that never can be cured. Attend, I pray you, to the situation and prosperity of Benfield, Hastings, and others of that sort. The last of these has been treated by the company with an asperity of reprehension that has no parallel. They lament, quote, that the power of disposing of their property for perpetuity should fall into such hands, end quote. Yet for 14 years, with little interruption, he has governed all their affairs of every description with an absolute sway. He has had himself the means of heaping up immense wealth, and during that period the fortunes of hundreds have depended on his smiles and frowns. He himself tells you he is encumbered with 250 young gentlemen, some of them of the best families in England, all of whom aim at returning with vast fortunes to Europe in the prime of life. He has then 250 of your children as his hostages for your good behaviour, and loaded for years as he has been with the execrations of the natives, with the censures of the Court of Directors, and struck and blasted with resolutions of this House, he still maintains the most despotic power ever known in India. He domineers with an overbearing sway in the assemblies of his pretended masters, and it is thought in a degree rash to venture to name his offences in this House even as grounds of a legislative remedy. On the other hand, consider the fate of those who have met with the applauses of the directors. Colonel Monson, one of the best of men, had his days shortened by the applauses, destitute of the support of the company. General Clavering, whose panegyric was made in every dispatch from England, whose hearse was bedewed with the tears and hung round with the eulogies of the Court of Directors, burst an honest and indignant heart at the treachery of those who ruined him by their praises. Uncommon patience and temper supported Mr. Francis a while longer, under the baneful influence of the commendation of the Court of Directors. His health, however, gave way at length, and in utter despair he returned to Europe. At his return, the doors of the India House were shut to this man, who had been the object of their constant admiration. He has indeed escaped with his life, but he has forfeited all expectation of credit, of consequence, party, and following. He may well say, minimo ministro, fer erit atque ideo nulli comes exio. This man whose deep reach of thought, whose large legislative conceptions, and whose grand plans of policy make the most shining part of our reports, from whence we have learned all our lessons, if we have learned any good ones. This man from whose materials those gentlemen who have least acknowledged it have yet spoken as from a brief. This man, driven from his employment, discountenanced by the directors, has had no other reward and no other distinction but that inward sunshine of the soul which a good conscience can always bestow upon itself. He has not yet had so much as a good word, but from a person too insignificant to make any other return for the means with which he has been furnished for performing his share of a duty which is equally urgent on us all. Add to this that, from the highest in place to the lowest, every British subject who, in obedience to the Company's orders, has been active in the discovery of peculations, has been ruined. They have been driven from India. When they made their appeal at home, they were not heard. When they attempted to return, they were stopped. No artifice of fraud, no violence of power has been omitted to destroy them in character as well as in fortune. Worse, far worse, has been the fate of the poor creatures, the natives of India, whom the hypocrisy of the Company has betrayed into complaint of oppression and discovery of peculation. The first women in Bengal, the Rani of Rajashahi, the Rani of Burdwan, the Rani of Ambua, by their weak and thoughtless trust in the Company's honour and protection are utterly ruined. The first of these women, a person of princely rank and once of correspondent fortune, who paid above 200,000 a year quit rent to the state, is, according to very credible information, so completely beggared as to stand in need of the relief of alms. Mohammed Reza Khan, the second Mussulman in Bengal, for having been distinguished by the ill-omened honour of the countenance and protection of the Court of Directors, was, without the pretence of any inquiry whatsoever into his conduct, stripped of all his employments and reduced to the lowest condition. His ancient rival for power, the Raja Nandkoma, was, by an insult on everything which India holds respectable and sacred, hanged in the face of all his nation by the judges you sent to protect that people. Hanged for a pretended crime, upon an ex post facto British Act of Parliament, in the midst of his evidence against Mr. Hastings. The accuser they saw hanged. The culprit, without acquittal or inquiry, triumphs on the ground of that murder. A murder not of Nandkumar only, but of all living testimony, and even of evidence yet unborn. From that time not a complaint has been heard from the natives against their governors. All the grievances of India have found a complete remedy. Men will not look to Acts of Parliament, to regulations, to declarations, to votes and resolutions. No, they are not such fools. They will ask, what is the road to power, credit, wealth, and honours? They will ask, what conduct ends in neglect, disgrace, poverty, exile, prison, and gibbet? These will teach them the course which they are to follow. It is your distribution of these that will give the character and tone to your government. All the rest is miserable grimace. When I accuse the Court of Directors of this habitual treachery in the use of reward and punishment, I do not mean to include all the individuals in that court. There have been, sir, very frequently men of the greatest integrity and virtue among them, and the contrariety in the declarations and conduct of that court has arisen. I take it from this that the honest directors have, by the force of matter of fact on the records, carried the reprobation of the evil measures of the servants in India. This could not be prevented whilst these records stared them in the face, nor were the delinquents, either here or there, very solicitous about their reputation, as long as they were able to secure their power. The agreement of their partisans to censure them blunted for a while the edge of a severe proceeding. It obtained for them a character of impartiality, which enabled them to recommend with some sort of grace, what will always carry a plausible appearance, those treacherous expedients called moderate measures. Whilst these were under discussion, new matter of complaint came over, which seemed to antiquate the first. The same circle was here trod round once more, and thus through the years they proceeded in a compromise of censure for punishment, until, by shame and despair, one after another, almost every man who preferred his duty to the company to the interest of their servants has been driven from that court. End of section 27. Section 28 of the works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Holly Mansfield. The works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 2. Speech on Mr. Fox's East India Bill, December 1st, 1783, Part 5. This, sir, has been their conduct, and it has been the result of the alteration which was insensibly made in their constitution. The change was made insensibly, but it is now strong and adult, and as public and declared as it is fixed beyond all power of reformation, so that there is none who hears me that is not as certain as I am, that the company in the sense in which it was formerly understood has no existence. The question is not what injury you may do to the proprietors of India stock, for there are no such men to be injured. If the active, ruling part of the company who form the general court, who fill the offices and direct the measures, the rest tell for nothing, were persons who held their stock as a means of their subsistence, who in the part they took were only concerned in the government of India for the rise or fall of their dividend, it would be indeed a defective plan of policy. The interest of the people who are governed by them would not be their primary object, perhaps a very small part of their consideration at all. But then they might well be depended on, and perhaps more than persons in other respects preferable, for preventing the peculations of their servants to their own prejudice. Such a body would not easily have left their trade as a spoil to the avarice of those who received their wages. But now things are totally reversed. The stock is of no value, whether it be the qualification of a director or proprietor, and it is impossible that it should. A director's qualification may be worth about £2,500, and the interest at 8% is about £160 a year. Of what value is that, whether it rise to 10 or fall to 6 or to nothing, to him whose son, before he is in Bengal 2 months, and before he descends the stops of the council chamber, sells the grant of a single contract for £40,000? Accordingly, the stock is bought up in qualifications. The vote is not to protect the stock, but the stock is bought to acquire the vote, and the end of the vote is to cover and support against justice some man of power who has made an obnoxious fortune in India, or to maintain in power those who are actually employing it in the acquisition of such a fortune, and to avail themselves in return of his patronage, that he may shower the spoils of the East, "barbaric pearl and gold," on them, their families and dependents, so that all the relations of the company are not only changed but inverted. The servants in India are not appointed by the directors, but the directors are chosen by them. The trade is carried on with their capitals. To them the revenues of the country are mortgaged. The seat of the supreme power is in Calcutta. The house in Leadenhall Street is nothing more than a change for their agents, factors, and deputies to meet in, to take care of their affairs and support their interests, and this so avowedly that we see the known agents of the delinquent servants marshalling and disciplining their forces, and the prime spokesman in all their assemblies. Everything has followed in this order and according to the natural train of events. I will close what I have to say on the incorrigible condition of the company by stating to you a few facts that will leave no doubt of the obstinacy of that corporation, and of their strength too, in resisting the reformation of their servants. By these facts you will be enabled to discover the sole grounds upon which they are tenacious of their charter. It is now more than 2 years that, upon account of the gross abuses and ruinous situation of the company's affairs, which occasioned the cry of the whole world long before it was taken up here, that we instituted 2 committees to inquire into the mismanagements by which the company's affairs had been brought to the brink of ruin. These inquiries had been pursued with unremitting diligence, and a great body of facts was collected and printed for general information. In the result of those inquiries, although the committees consisted of very different descriptions, they were unanimous. They joined in censuring the conduct of the Indian administration and enforcing the responsibility upon 2 men, whom this House, in consequence of these reports, declared it to be the duty of the directors to remove from their stations and recall to Great Britain, because they had acted in a manner repugnant to the honour and policy of this nation, and thereby brought great calamities on India and enormous expenses on the East India Company. Here was no attempt on the charter. Here was no question of their privileges. To vindicate their own honour, to support their own interests, to enforce obedience to their own orders, these were the sole object of the monetary resolution of this House. But as soon as the General Court could assemble, they assembled to demonstrate who they really were. Regardless of the proceedings of this House, they ordered the directors not to carry into effect any resolution they might come to for the removal of Mr. Hastings and Mr. Hornby. The directors, still retaining some shadow of respect to this House, instituted an inquiry themselves, which continued from June to October, and, after an attentive perusal and full consideration of papers, resolved to take steps for removing the persons who had been the objects of our resolution, but not without a violent struggle against evidence. 7 directors went so far as to enter a protest against the vote of their court. Upon this the General Court takes the alarm. It reassembles, it orders the directors to rescind their resolution, that is, not to recall Mr. Hastings and Mr. Hornby, and to despise the resolution of the House of Commons, without so much as the pretence of looking into a single paper, without the formality of instituting any committee of inquiry. They superseded all the labours of their own directors and of this House. It will naturally occur to ask how it was possible that they should not attempt some sort of examination into facts, as a colour for their resistance to a public authority proceeding so very deliberately, and exerted, apparently at least, in favour of their own. The answer, and the only answer which can be given, is that they were afraid that their true relation should be mistaken. They were afraid that their patrons and masters in India should attribute their support of them to an opinion of their cause and not to an attachment to their power. They were afraid it should be suspected that they did not mean blindly to support them in the use they made of that power. They determined to show that they at least were set against reformation, that they were firmly resolved to bring the territories, the trade, and the stock of the company to ruin, rather than be wanting in fidelity to their nominal servants and real masters in the ways they took to their private fortunes. Even since the beginning of this session, the same act of audacity was repeated, with the same circumstances of contempt of all the decorum of inquiry on their part, and of all the proceedings of this House. They again made it a request to their favourite and your culprit to keep his post, and thanked and applauded him without calling for a paper which could afford light into the merit or demerit of the transaction, and without giving themselves a moment's time to consider or even to understand the articles of the Mahratta peace. The fact is that for a long time there was a struggle, a faint one indeed, between the company and their servants, but it is a struggle no longer. For some time the superiority has been decided. The interests abroad are become the settled, preponderating weight both in the Court of Proprietors and the Court of Directors. Even the attempt you have made to inquire into their practices and to reform abuses has raised and piqued them to a far more regular and steady support. The company has made a common cause and identified themselves with the destroyers of India. They have taken on themselves all that mass of enormity. They are supporting what you have reprobated. Those you condemn, they applaud. Those you order home to answer for their conduct, they request to stay, and thereby encourage to proceed in their practices. Thus the servants of the East India Company triumph, and the representatives of the people of Great Britain are defeated. I therefore conclude, what you all conclude, that this body, being totally perverted from the purposes of its institution, is utterly incorrigible, and because they are incorrigible, both in conduct and constitution, power ought to be taken out of their hands, just on the same principles on which have been made all the just changes and revolutions of government that have taken place since the beginning of the world. I will now say a few words to the general principle of the plan which is set up against that of my right honourable friend. It is to recommit the government of India to the Court of Directors. Those who would commit the reformation of India to the destroyers of it are the enemies to that reformation. They would make a distinction between directors and proprietors, which in the present state of things does not, cannot exist. But a right honourable gentleman says he would keep the present government of India in the Court of Directors, and would, to curb them, provide salutary regulations. Wonderful! That is, he would appoint the old offenders to correct the old offences, and he would render the vicious and the foolish wise and virtuous by salutary regulations. He would appoint the wolf as guardian of the sheep, but he has invented a curious muzzle, by which this protecting wolf shall not be able to open his jaws above an inch or two at the utmost. Thus his work is finished. But I tell the right honourable gentleman that controlled depravity is not innocence, and that it is not the labour of delinquency in chains that will correct abuses. All these gentlemen of the direction animadvert on the partners of their own guilt. Never did a serious plan of amending of any old tyrannical establishment propose the authors and abettors of the abuses as the reformers of them. If the undone people of India see their old oppressors in confirmed power, even by the Reformation, they will expect nothing but what they will certainly feel, continuance or rather an aggravation of all their former sufferings. They look to the seat of power and to the persons who fill it, and they despise those gentlemen's regulations as much as the gentlemen do who talk of them. But there is a cure for everything. Take away, say they, the Court of Proprietors, and the Court of Directors will do their duty. Yes, as they have done it hitherto. That the evils in India have solely arisen from the Court of Proprietors is grossly false. In many of them the directors were heartily concurring, in most of them they were encouraging and sometimes commanding, in all they were conniving. But who are to choose this well-regulated and reforming Court of Directors? Why, the very proprietors who are excluded from all management for the abuse of their power. They will choose undoubtedly out of themselves men like themselves, and those who are most forward in resisting your authority, those who are most engaged in faction or interest with the delinquents abroad, will be the objects of their selection. But gentlemen say that when this choice is made, the proprietors are not to interfere in the measures of the directors, whilst those directors are busy in the control of their common patrons and masters in India. No, indeed, I believe they will not desire to interfere. They will choose those whom they know may be trusted, safely trusted, to act in strict conformity to their common principles, manners, measures, interests, and connections. They will want neither monitor nor control. It is not easy to choose men to act in conformity to a public interest against their private, but a sure dependence may be had on those who are chosen to forward their private interest at the expense of the public. But if the directors should slip and deviate into rectitude, the punishment is in the hands of the General Court, and it will surely be remembered to them at their next election. If the government of India wants no reformation, but gentlemen are amusing themselves with a theory, conceiving a more democratic or aristocratic mode of government for these dependencies, or if they are in a dispute only about patronage, the dispute is with me of so little concern that I should not take the pains to utter an affirmative or negative to any proposition in it. If it be only for a theoretical amusement that they are to propose a bill, the thing is at best frivolous and unnecessary. But if the company's government is not only full of abuse, but is one of the most corrupt and destructive tyrannies that probably ever existed in the world, as I am sure it is, what a cruel mockery would it be, in me and in those who think like me, to propose this kind of remedy for this kind of evil. I now come to the third objection, that this bill will increase the influence of the Crown. An honourable gentleman has demanded of me whether I was in earnest when I proposed to this House a plan for the reduction of that influence. Indeed, sir, I was much, very much in earnest. My heart was deeply concerned in it, and I hope the public has not lost the effect of it. How far my judgment was right, for what concerned personal favour and consequence to myself, I shall not presume to determine, nor is its effect upon me of any moment. But as to this bill, whether it increases the influence of the Crown or not, is a question I should be ashamed to ask. If I am not able to correct a system of oppression and tyranny that goes to the utter ruin of 30 millions of my fellow creatures and fellow subjects, but by some increase to the influence of the Crown, I am ready here to declare that I, who have been so active to reduce it, shall be at least as active and strenuous to restore it again. I am no lover of names. I contend for the substance of good and protecting government, let it come from what quarter it will. But I am not obliged to have recourse to this expedient. Much, very much the contrary. I am sure that the influence of the Crown will by no means aid a reformation of this kind, which can neither be originated nor supported but by the uncorrupt public virtue of the representatives of the people of England. Let it once get into the ordinary course of administration, and to me all hopes of reformation are gone. I am far from knowing or believing that this bill will increase the influence of the Crown. We all know that the Crown has ever had some influence in the Court of Directors, and that it has been extremely increased by the Acts of 1773 and 1780. The gentlemen who, as part of their reformation, propose, quote, a more active control on the part of the Crown, end quote, which is to put the Directors under a Secretary of State specially named for that purpose, must know that their project will increase it further. But that old influence has had, and the new will have, incurable inconveniences which cannot happen under the parliamentary establishment proposed in this bill. An honourable gentleman, (Footnote: Governor Johnstone), not now in his place, but who is well acquainted with the India Company and by no means a friend to this bill, has told you that a ministerial influence has always been predominant in that body, and that to make the directors pliant to their purposes, ministers generally caused persons meanly qualified to be chosen as directors. According to his idea, to secure subserviency, they submitted the company's affairs to the direction of incapacity. This was to ruin the company in order to govern it. This was certainly influence in the very worst form in which it could appear. At best it was clandestine and irresponsible. Whether this was done so much upon system as that gentleman supposes, I greatly doubt, but such in effect the operation of government on that court unquestionably was, and such, under a similar constitution, it will be forever. Ministers must be wholly removed from the management of the affairs of India, or they will have an influence in its patronage. The thing is inevitable. Their scheme of a new Secretary of State, quote, with a more vigorous control, end quote, is not much better than a repetition of the measure which we know by experience will not do. Since the year 1773 and the year 1780, the company has been under the control of the Secretary of State's office, and we had then 3 Secretaries of State. If more than this is done, then they annihilate the direction which they pretend to support, and they augment the influence of the Crown, of whose growth they affect so great a horror. But in truth, this scheme of reconciling a direction really and truly deliberative with an office, really and substantially controlling, is a sort of machinery that can be kept in order but a very short time. Either the directors will dwindle into clerks, or the Secretary of State, as hitherto has been the course, will leave everything to them, often through design, often through neglect. If both should affect activity, collision, procrastination, delay, and in the end utter confusion must ensue. But, sir, there is one kind of influence far greater than that of the nomination to office. This gentleman in opposition have totally overlooked, although it now exists in its full vigour, and it will do so upon their scheme in at least as much force as it does now. That influence this bill cuts up by the roots. I mean the influence of protection. I shall explain myself. The office given to a young man going to India is of trifling consequence, but he that goes out an insignificant boy in a few years returns a great nabob. Mr. Hastings says he has 250 of that kind of raw materials, who expect to be speedily manufactured into the merchantable quality I mention. One of these gentlemen, suppose, returns hither laden with odium and with riches. When he comes to England, he comes as to a prison or as to a sanctuary, and either is ready for him according to his demeanour. What is the influence in the grant of any place in India to that which is acquired by the protection or compromise with such guilt, and with the command of such riches, under the dominion of the hopes and fears which power is able to hold out to every man in that condition? That man's whole fortune, 500,000 perhaps, becomes an instrument of influence without a shilling of charge to the civil list, and the influx of fortunes which stand in need of this protection is continual. It works both ways. It influences the delinquent, and it may corrupt the minister. Compare the influence acquired by appointing, for instance, even a Governor-General, and that obtained by protecting him. I shall push this no further, but I wish gentlemen to roll it a little in their own minds. The bill before you cuts off this source of influence. Its design and main scope is to regulate the administration of India upon the principles of a court of judicature, and to exclude, as far as human prudence can exclude, all possibility of a corrupt partiality in appointing to office, or supporting in office, or covering from inquiry and punishment, any person who has abused or shall abuse his authority. At the board, as appointed and regulated by this bill, reward and punishment cannot be shifted and reversed by a whisper. That commission becomes fatal to cabal, to intrigue, and to secret representation, those instruments of the ruin of India. He that cuts off the means of premature fortune, and the power of protecting it when acquired, strikes a deadly blow at the great fund, the bank, the capital stock of Indian influence, which cannot be vested anywhere or in any hands without most dangerous consequences to the public. The third and contradictory objection is that this bill does not increase the influence of the Crown. On the contrary, that the just power of the Crown will be lessened and transferred to the use of a party by giving the patronage of India to a commission nominated by Parliament and independent of the Crown. The contradiction is glaring, and it has been too well exposed to make it necessary for me to insist upon it. But passing the contradiction, and taking it without any relation of all objections, that is the most extraordinary. Do not gentlemen know that the Crown has not at present the grant of a single office under the Company, civil or military, at home or abroad? So far as the Crown is concerned, it is certainly rather a gainer, for the vacant offices in the new commission are to be filled up by the King. It is argued, as a part of the bill, derogatory to the prerogatives of the Crown, that the commissioners named in the bill are to continue for a short term of years, too short in my opinion, and because, during that time, they are not at the mercy of every predominant faction of the court. Does not this objection lie against the present directors, none of whom are named by the Crown, and a proportion of whom hold for this very term of 4 years? Did it not lie against the Governor-General and Council named in the Act of 1773, who were invested by name as the present commissioners are to be appointed in the body of the Act of Parliament, who were to hold their places for a term of years, and were not removable at the discretion of the Crown? Did it not lie against the reappointment in the year 1780 upon the very same terms? Yet at none of these times, whatever other objections the scheme might be liable to, was it supposed to be a derogation to the just prerogative of the Crown that a commission created by Act of Parliament should have its members named by the authority which called it into existence. This is not the disposal by Parliament of any office derived from the authority of the Crown, or now disposable by that authority. It is so far from being anything new, violent, or alarming, that I do not recollect in any parliamentary commission, down to the commissioners of the land tax, that it has ever been otherwise. The objection of the tenure for 4 years is an objection to all places that are not held during pleasure. But in that objection I pronounce the gentlemen, from my knowledge of their complexion and of their principles, to be perfectly in earnest. The party, say these gentlemen, of the minister who proposes this scheme will be rendered powerful by it, for he will name his party friends to the commission. This objection against the party is a party objection, and in this too the gentlemen are perfectly serious. They see that, if by any intrigue they should succeed to office, they will lose the clandestine patronage, the true instrument of clandestine influence, enjoyed in the name of subservient directors, and of wealthy, trembling Indian delinquents. But as often as they are beaten off this ground, they return to it again. The minister will name his friends, and persons of his own party. Whom should he name? Should he name his adversaries? Should he name those whom he cannot trust? Should he name those to execute his plans who are the declared enemies to the principles of his reform? His character is here at stake. If he proposes for his own ends, but he never will propose, such names as, from their want of rank, fortune, character, ability, or knowledge, are likely to betray or to fall short of their trust. He is in an independent House of Commons. In a House of Commons which has, by its own virtue, destroyed the instruments of parliamentary subservience. This House of Commons would not endure the sound of such names. He would perish by the means which he is supposed to pursue for the security of his power. The first pledge he must give of his sincerity in this great reform will be in the confidence which ought to be reposed in those names. For my part, sir, in this business I put all indirect considerations wholly out of my mind. My sole question on each clause of the bill amounts to this: is the measure proposed required by the necessities of India? I cannot consent totally to lose sight of the real wants of the people who are the objects of it, and to hunt after every matter of party squabble that may be started on the several provisions. On the question of duration of the commission I am clear and decided. Can any one who has taken the smallest trouble to be informed concerning the affairs of India, amuse himself with so strange an imagination as that the habitual despotism and oppression, that the monopolies, the peculations, the universal destruction of all the legal authority of this kingdom, which have been for 20 years maturing to their present enormity, combined with the distance of the scene, the boldness and artifice of delinquents, their combination, their excessive wealth, and the faction they have made in England, can be fully corrected in a shorter term than 4 years? None has hazarded such an assertion. None who has a regard for his reputation will hazard it. Sir, the gentlemen, whoever they are, who shall be appointed to this commission, have an undertaking of magnitude on their hands, and their stability must not only be, but it must be thought, real. And who is it will believe that anything short of an establishment made, supported, and fixed in its duration, with all the authority of Parliament, can be thought secure of a reasonable stability? The plan of my honourable friend is the reverse of that of reforming by the authors of the abuse. The best we could expect from them is, that they should not continue their ancient pernicious activity. To those we could think of nothing but applying control, as we are sure that even a regard to their reputation, if any such thing exists in them, would oblige them to cover, to conceal, to suppress, and consequently to prevent all cure of the grievances of India. For what can be discovered which is not to their disgrace? Every attempt to correct an abuse would be a satire on their former administration. Every man they should pretend to call to an account would be found their instrument or their accomplice. They can never see a beneficial regulation but with a view to defeat it. The shorter the tenure of such persons, the better would be the chance of some amendment. But the system of the bill is different. It calls in persons in no wise concerned with any act censured by Parliament, persons generated with and for the reform of which they are themselves the most essential part. To these chief regulations in the bill are helps, not fetters. They are authorities to support, not regulations to restrain them. From these we look for much more than innocence. From these we expect zeal, firmness, and unremitted activity. Their duty, their character, binds them to proceedings of vigour, and they ought to have a tenure in their office which precludes all fear whilst they are acting up to the purposes of their trust, a tenure without which none will undertake plans that require a series and system of acts. When they know that they cannot be whispered out of their duty, that their public conduct cannot be censured without a public discussion, that the schemes which they have begun will not be committed to those who will have an interest and credit in defeating and disgracing them, then we may entertain hopes. The tenure is for 4 years, or during their good behaviour. That good behaviour is as long as they are true to the principles of the bill, and the judgment is in either House of Parliament. This is the tenure of your judges, and the valuable principle of the bill is to make a judicial administration for India. It is to give confidence in the execution of a duty which requires as much perseverance and fortitude as can fall to the lot of any that is born of woman. As to the gain by party from the right honourable gentleman's bill, let it be shown that this supposed party advantage is pernicious to its object, and the objection is of weight. But until this is done, and this has not been attempted, I shall consider the sole objection from its tendency to promote the interest of a party as altogether contemptible. The kingdom is divided into parties, and it ever has been so divided, and it ever will be so divided, and if no system for relieving the subjects of this kingdom from oppression, and snatching its affairs from ruin, can be adopted, until it is demonstrated that no party can derive an advantage from it, no good can ever be done in this country. If party is to derive an advantage from the reform of India, which is more than I know or believe, it ought to be that party which alone in this kingdom has its reputation, nay, its very being, pledged to the protection and preservation of that part of the empire. Great fear is expressed that the commissioners named in this bill will show some regard to a minister out of place. To men made like the objectors this must appear criminal. Let it, however, be remembered by others that if the commissioners should be his friends, they cannot be his slaves. But dependents are not in a condition to adhere to friends, nor to principles, nor to any uniform line of conduct. They may begin censors, and be obliged to end accomplices. They may be even put under the direction of those whom they were appointed to punish. The fourth and last objection is that the bill will hurt public credit. I do not know whether this requires an answer, but if it does, look to your foundations. The sinking fund is the pillar of credit in this country, and let it not be forgot that the distresses owing to the mismanagement of the East India Company have already taken 1 million from that fund by the non-payment of duties. The bills drawn upon the company, which are about 4 millions, cannot be accepted without the consent of the Treasury. The Treasury, acting under a parliamentary trust and authority, pledges the public for these millions. If they pledge the public must have a security in its hands for the management of this interest, or the national credit is gone. For otherwise it is not only the East India Company, which has great interest, that is undone, but, clinging to the security of all your funds, it drags down the rest, and the whole fabric perishes in one ruin. If this bill does not provide a direction of integrity and of ability competent to that trust, the objection is fatal. If it does, public credit must depend on the support of the bill. It has been said, if you violate this charter, what security has the charter of the Bank, in which public credit is so deeply concerned, and even the charter of London, in which the rights of so many subjects are involved? I answer, in the like case, they have no security at all. No security at all. If the Bank should, by every species of mismanagement, fall into a similar state to that of the East India Company, if it should be oppressed with demands it could not answer, engagements which it could not perform, and with bills for which it could not procure payment, no charter should protect the mismanagement from correction, and such public grievances from redress. If the City of London had the means and will of destroying an empire, and of cruelly oppressing and tyrannizing over millions of men as good as themselves, the charter of the City of London should prove no sanction to such tyranny and such oppression. Charters are kept when their purposes are maintained. They are violated when the privilege is supported against its end and its object. Now, sir, I have finished all I proposed to say, as my reasons for giving my vote to this bill. If I am wrong, it is not for want of pains to know what is right. This pledge, at least, of my rectitude I have given to my country. And now, having done my duty to the bill, let me say a word to the author. I should leave him to his own noble sentiments, if the unworthy and illiberal language with which he has been treated, beyond all example of parliamentary liberty, did not make a few words necessary, not so much in justice to him as to my own feelings. I must say, then, that it will be a distinction honourable to the age, that the rescue of the greatest number of the human race that ever were so grievously oppressed from the greatest tyranny that was ever exercised, has fallen to the lot of abilities and dispositions equal to the task. That it has fallen to one who has the enlargement to comprehend, the spirit to undertake, and the eloquence to support so great a measure of hazardous benevolence. His spirit is not owing to his ignorance of the state of men and things. He well knows what snares are spread about his path, from personal animosity, from court intrigues, and possibly from popular delusion. But he is put to hazard his ease, his security, his interest, his power, even his darling popularity, for the benefit of a people whom he has never seen. This is the road that all heroes have trod before him. He is traduced and abused for his supposed motives. He will remember that obloquy is the necessary ingredient in the composition of all true glory. He will remember that it was not only in the Roman customs, but it is in the nature and constitution of things, that calumny and abuse are essential parts of triumph. These thoughts will support a mind which only exists for honour under the burden of temporary reproach. He is doing indeed a great good, such as rarely falls to the lot, and almost as rarely coincides with the desires of any man. Let him use his time. Let him give the whole length of the reins to his benevolence. He is now on a great eminence, where the eyes of mankind are turned to him. He may live long, he may do much, but here is the summit. He never can exceed what he does this day. He has faults, but they are faults that, though they may in a small degree tarnish the lustre and sometimes impede the march of his abilities, have nothing in them to extinguish the fire of great virtues. In those faults there is no mixture of deceit, of hypocrisy, of pride, of ferocity, of complexional despotism, or want of feeling for the distresses of mankind. His are faults which might exist in a descendant of Henry IV. Of France, as they did exist in that father of his country. Henry IV. Wished that he might live to see a fowl in the pot of every peasant in his kingdom. That sentiment of homely benevolence was worth all the splendid sayings that are recorded of kings. But he wished, perhaps, for more than could be obtained, and the goodness of the man exceeded the power of the king. But this gentleman, a subject, may this day say this at least with truth, that he secures the rice in his pot to every man in India. A poet of antiquity thought it one of the first distinctions to a prince whom he meant to celebrate, that through a long succession of generations he had been the progenitor of an able and virtuous citizen, who by force of the arts of peace had corrected governments of oppression and suppressed wars of rapine. Indole pro quanta juvenis, quantumque deterrus, Ausonie populis ventura in saecula civem, ille super gangem, super exauditus et indos, implebit terras vocae et feodialia bella, fulmina compescet lingue. This was what was said of the predecessor of the only person to whose eloquence it does not wrong that of the mover of this bill to be compared. But the Ganges and the Indus are the patrimony of the fame of my honourable friend, and not of Cicero. I confess I anticipate with joy the reward of those whose whole consequence, power, and authority exist only for the benefit of mankind. And I carry my mind to all the people and all the names and descriptions that, relieved by this bill, will bless the labours of this Parliament, and the confidence which the best House of Commons has given to him who the best deserves it. The little cavils of party will not be heard where freedom and happiness will be felt. There is not a tongue, a nation, or religion in India which will not bless the presiding care and manly beneficence of this House, and of him who proposes to you this great work. Your names will never be separated before the throne of the divine goodness, in whatever language or with whatever rites pardon is asked for sin, and reward for those who imitate the Godhead in his universal bounty to his creatures. These honours you deserve, and they will surely be paid when all the jargon of influence and party and patronage are swept into oblivion. I have spoken what I think and what I feel of the mover of this bill. An honourable friend of mine, speaking his merits, was charged with having made a studied panegyric. I don't know what his was. Mine, I am sure, is a studied panegyric, the fruit of much meditation, the result of the observation of near 20 years. For my own part, I am happy that I have lived to see this day. I feel myself overpaid for the labours of 18 years, when at this late period I am able to take my share by one humble vote in destroying a tyranny that exists to the disgrace of this nation and the destruction of so large a part of the human species. End of section 28.
Section 29 of the Works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 2. A Representation to His Majesty, moved in the House of Commons, June 14, 1784. Part 1. Preface. The representation now given to the public relates to some of the most essential privileges of the House of Commons. It would appear of little importance if it were to be judged by its reception in the place where it was proposed. There it was rejected without debate. The subject matter may, perhaps, hereafter appear to merit a more serious consideration. Thinking men will scarcely regard the penal dissolution of a parliament as a very trifling concern. Such a dissolution must operate forcibly as an example, and it much imports the people of this kingdom to consider what lesson that example is to teach. The late House of Commons was not accused of an interested compliance to the will of a court. The charge against them was of a different nature. They were charged with being actuated by an extravagant spirit of independency. This species of offence is so closely connected with merit, this vice bears so near a resemblance to virtue, that the flight of a House of Commons above the exact temperate medium of independence ought to be correctly ascertained, lest we give encouragement to dispositions of a less generous nature and less safe for the people. We ought to call for very solid and convincing proofs of the existence, and of the magnitude too, of the evils which are charged to an independent spirit, before we give sanction to any measure, that by checking a spirit so easily damped and so hard to be excited, may affect the liberty of a part of our constitution, which, if not free, is worse than useless. The editor does not deny that by possibility such an abuse may exist, but prima fronte there is no reason to presume it. The House of Commons is not, by its complexion, peculiarly subject to the distempers of an independent habit. Very little compulsion is necessary on the part of the people to render it abundantly complacent to ministers and favourites of all descriptions. It required a great length of time, very considerable industry and perseverance, no vulgar policy, the union of many men and many tempers, and the concurrence of events which do not happen every day, to build up an independent House of Commons. Its demolition was accomplished in a moment, and it was the work of ordinary hands. But to construct is a matter of skill, to demolish, force and fury are sufficient. The late House of Commons has been punished for its independence. That example is made. Have we an example on record of a House of Commons punished for its servility? The rewards of a Senate so disposed are manifest to the world. Several gentlemen are very desirous of altering the constitution of the House of Commons, but they must alter the frame and constitution of human nature itself before they can so fashion it by any mode of election that its conduct will not be influenced by reward and punishment, by fame and by disgrace. If these examples take root in the minds of men, what members hereafter will be bold enough not to be corrupt, especially as the king's highway of obsequiousness is so very broad and easy? To make a passive member of Parliament, no dignity of mind, no principles of honour, no resolution, no ability, no industry, no learning, no experience are in the least degree necessary. To defend a post of importance against a powerful enemy requires an Eliot. A drunken invalid is qualified to hoist a white flag or to deliver up the keys of the fortress on his knees. The gentlemen chosen into this Parliament for the purpose of this surrender were bred to better things, and are no doubt qualified for other service. But for this strenuous exertion of inactivity, for the vigorous task of submission and passive obedience, all their learning and ability are rather a matter of personal ornament to themselves than of the least use in the performance of their duty. The present surrender, therefore, of rights and privileges without examination, and the resolution to support any minister given by the secret advisers of the Crown, determines not only on all the power and authority of the House, but it settles the character and description of the men who are to compose it, and perpetuates that character as long as it may be thought expedient to keep up a phantom of popular representation. It is for the chance of some amendment before this new settlement takes a permanent form, and while the matter is yet soft and ductile, that the editor has republished this piece and added some notes and explanations to it. His intention, he hopes, will excuse him to the original mover and to the world. He acts from a strong sense of the incurable ill effects of holding out the conduct of the late House of Commons as an example to be shunned by future representatives of the people. Motion relative to the speech from the throne. Monday, 14th June 1784. A motion was made that a representation be presented to His Majesty, most humbly to offer to his royal consideration, that the address of this House upon His Majesty's speech from the throne was dictated solely by our conviction of His Majesty's own most gracious intentions towards his people, which, as we feel with gratitude, so we are ever ready to acknowledge with cheerfulness and satisfaction. Impressed with these sentiments, we were willing to separate from our general expressions of duty, respect, and veneration to His Majesty's royal person and his princely virtues all discussion whatever with relation to several of the matters suggested, and several of the expressions employed in that speech. That it was not fit or becoming that any decided opinion should be formed by his faithful Commons on that speech, without a degree of deliberation adequate to the importance of the object. Having afforded ourselves due time for that deliberation, we do now most humbly beg leave to represent to His Majesty that, in the speech from the throne, his ministers have thought proper to use a language of a very alarming import, unauthorized by the practice of good times, and irreconcilable to the principles of this government. Humbly to express to His Majesty that it is the privilege and duty of this House to guard the Constitution from all infringement on the part of ministers, and, whenever the occasion requires it, to warn them against any abuse of the authorities committed to them. But it is very lately that, in a manner not more unseemly than irregular and preposterous, ministers have thought proper, by admonition from the throne, implying distrust and reproach, to convey the expectations of the people to us, their sole representatives, and have presumed to caution us, the natural guardians of the Constitution, against any infringement of it on our parts. This dangerous innovation we, His faithful Commons, think it our duty to mark, and as these admonitions from the throne, by their frequent repetition, seem intended to lead gradually to the establishment of a usage, we hold ourselves bound thus solemnly to protest against them. This House will be, as it ever ought to be, anxiously attentive to the inclinations and interests of its constituents, nor do we desire to straiten any of the avenues to the throne, or to either House of Parliament. But the ancient order in which the rights of the people have been exercised is not a restriction of these rights. It is a method providently framed in favour of those privileges which it preserves and enforces, by keeping in that course which has been found the most effectual for answering their ends. His Majesty may receive the opinions and wishes of individuals under their signatures, and of bodies corporate under their seals, as expressing their own particular sense, and he may grant such redress as the legal powers of the Crown enable the Crown to afford. This and the other House of Parliament may also receive the wishes of such corporations and individuals by petition. The collective sense of his people His Majesty is to receive from his Commons in Parliament assembled. It would destroy the whole spirit of the Constitution if his Commons were to receive that sense from the ministers of the Crown, or to admit them to be a proper or a regular channel for conveying it. That the ministers in the said speech declare, His Majesty has a just and confident reliance that we, his faithful Commons, are animated with the same sentiments of loyalty and the same attachment to our excellent Constitution, which he had the happiness to see so fully manifested in every part of the kingdom. To represent that his faithful Commons have never foiled in loyalty to His Majesty. It is new to them to be reminded of it. It is unnecessary and invidious to press it upon them by any example. This recommendation of loyalty, after His Majesty has sat for so many years, with the full support of all descriptions of his subjects, on the throne of this kingdom, at a time of profound peace, and without any pretence of the existence or apprehension of war or conspiracy, becomes in itself a source of no small jealousy to his faithful Commons. As many circumstances lead us to apprehend that therein the ministers have reference to some other measures and principles of loyalty, and to some other ideas of the Constitution than the laws require, or the practice of Parliament will admit. No regular communication of the proofs of loyalty and attachment to the Constitution, alluded to in the speech from the throne, have been laid before this House, in order to enable us to judge of the nature, tendency, or occasion of them, or in what particular acts they were displayed. But if we are to suppose the manifestations of loyalty, which are held out to us as an example for imitation, consist in certain addresses delivered to His Majesty, promising support to His Majesty in the exercise of his prerogative, and thanking His Majesty for removing certain of his ministers, on account of the votes they have given upon bills depending in Parliament. If this be the example of loyalty alluded to in the speech from the throne, then we must beg leave to express our serious concern for the impression which has been made on any of our fellow subjects, by misrepresentations which have seduced them into a seeming approbation of proceedings subversive of their own freedom. We conceive that the opinions delivered in these papers were not well considered, nor were the parties duly informed of the nature of the matters on which they were called to determine, nor of those proceedings of Parliament which they were led to censure. We shall act more advisedly. The loyalty we shall manifest will not be the same with theirs, but we trust it will be equally sincere and more enlightened. It is no slight authority which shall persuade us, by receiving as proofs of loyalty the mistaken principles lightly taken up in these addresses, obliquely to criminate, with a heavy and ungrounded charge of disloyalty and disaffection, an uncorrupt, independent, and reforming Parliament. Above all, we shall take care that none of the rights and privileges always claimed, and since the accession of His Majesty's illustrious family constantly exercised by this House, and which we hold and exercise in trust for the Commons of Great Britain and for their benefit, shall be constructively surrendered, or even weakened and impaired, under ambiguous phrases and implications of censure on the late parliamentary proceedings. If these claims are not well founded, they ought to be honestly abandoned. If they are just, they ought to be steadily and resolutely maintained. Of His Majesty's own gracious disposition towards the true principles of our free constitution, His faithful Commons never did or could entertain a doubt. But we humbly beg leave to express to His Majesty our uneasiness concerning other new and unusual expressions of His ministers, declaratory of a resolution to support in their just balance the rights and privileges of every branch of the legislature. It were desirable that all hazardous theories concerning a balance of rights and privileges, a mode of expression wholly foreign to parliamentary usage, might have been forborne. His Majesty's faithful Commons are well instructed in their own rights and privileges, which they are determined to maintain on the footing upon which they were handed down from their ancestors. They are not unacquainted with the rights and privileges of the House of Peers, and they know and respect the lawful prerogatives of the Crown, but they do not think it safe to admit anything concerning the existence of a balance of those rights, privileges, and prerogatives, nor are they able to discern to what objects ministers would apply their fiction of a balance, nor what they would consider as a just one. These unauthorized doctrines have a tendency to stir improper discussions and to lead to mischievous innovations in the Constitution. That His faithful Commons most humbly recommend, instead of the inconsiderate speculations of unexperienced men, that on all occasions resort should be had to the happy practice of Parliament, and to those solid maxims of government which have prevailed since the accession of His Majesty's illustrious family, as furnishing the only safe principles on which the Crown and Parliament can proceed. We think it the more necessary to be cautious on this head, as in the last Parliament the present ministers have thought proper to countenance, if not to suggest, an attack upon the most clear and undoubted rights and privileges of this House. Fearing from these extraordinary admonitions and from the new doctrines, which seem to have dictated several unusual expressions, that His Majesty has been abused by false representations of the late proceedings in Parliament, we think it our duty respectfully to inform His Majesty that no attempt whatever has been made against his lawful prerogatives, or against the rights and privileges of the peers by the late House of Commons in any of their addresses, votes, or resolutions. Neither do we know of any proceeding by bill in which it was proposed to abridge the extent of his royal prerogative. But if such provision had existed in any bill, we protest and we declare against all speeches, acts, or addresses from any persons whatsoever which have a tendency to consider such bills, or the persons concerned in them, as just objects of any kind of censure and punishment from the throne. Necessary reformations may hereafter require, as they have frequently done in former times, limitations and abridgments, and in some cases an entire extinction of some branch of prerogative. If bills should be improper in the form in which they appear in the House where they originate, they are liable, by the wisdom of this Constitution, to be corrected and even to be totally set aside elsewhere. This is the known, the legal, and the safe remedy. But whatever, by the manifestation of the royal displeasure, tends to intimidate individual members from proposing, or this House from receiving, debating, and passing bills, tends to prevent even the beginning of every reformation in the state, and utterly destroys the deliberate capacity of Parliament. We therefore claim, demand, and insist upon it as our undoubted right, that no persons shall be deemed proper objects of animadversion by the Crown in any mode whatever, for the votes which they give or the propositions which they make in Parliament. We humbly conceive that besides its share of the legislative power and its right of impeachment, that by the law and usage of Parliament, this House has other powers and capacities which it is bound to maintain. This House is assured that our humble advice on the exercise of prerogative will be heard with the same attention with which it has ever been regarded, and that it will be followed by the same effects which it has ever produced during the happy and glorious reigns of His Majesty's royal progenitors, not doubting but that, in all those points, we shall be considered as a council of wisdom and weight to advise, and not merely as an accuser of competence to criminate. This House claims both capacities, and we trust that we shall be left to our free discretion which of them we shall employ as best calculated for His Majesty's and the national service. Whenever we shall see it expedient to offer our advice concerning His Majesty's servants, who are those of the public, we confidently hope that the personal favour of any minister or any set of ministers will not be more dear to His Majesty than the credit and character of a House of Commons. It is an experiment full of peril to put the representative wisdom and justice of His Majesty's people in the wrong. It is a crooked and desperate design, leading to mischief, the extent of which no human wisdom can foresee, to attempt to form a prerogative party in the nation, to be resorted to as occasion shall require, in derogation from the authority of the Commons of Great Britain in Parliament assembled. It is a contrivance full of danger for ministers to set up the representative and constituent bodies of the Commons of this kingdom as two separate and distinct powers, formed to counterpoise each other, leaving the preference in the hands of secret advisers of the Crown. In such a situation of things, these advisers, taking advantage of the differences which may accidentally arise or may purposely be fomented between them, will have it in their choice to resort to the one or the other, as may best suit the purposes of their sinister ambition. By exciting an emulation and contest between the representative and the constituent bodies, as parties contending for credit and influence at the throne, sacrifices will be made by both, and the whole can end in nothing else than the destruction of the dearest rights and liberties of the nation. If there must be another mode of conveying the collective sense of the people to the throne than that by the House of Commons, it ought to be fixed and defined, and its authority ought to be settled. It ought not to exist in so precarious and dependent a state as that ministers should have it in their power, at their own mere pleasure, to acknowledge it with respect or to reject it with scorn. It is the undoubted prerogative of the Crown to dissolve Parliament, but we beg leave to lay before His Majesty that it is, of all the trusts vested in His Majesty, the most critical and delicate, and that in which this House has the most reason to require not only the good faith, but the favour of the Crown. His Commons are not always upon a par with His ministers in an application to popular judgment. It is not in the power of the members of this House to go to their election at the moment the most favourable for them. It is in the power of the Crown to choose a time for their dissolution, whilst great and arduous matters of state and legislation are depending, which may be easily misunderstood, and which cannot be fully explained before that misunderstanding may prove fatal to the honour that belongs and to the consideration that is due to members of Parliament. With His Majesty is the gift of all the rewards, the honours, distinctions, favours, and graces of the state. With His Majesty is the mitigation of all the rigours of the law, and we rejoice to see the Crown possessed of trusts calculated to obtain goodwill, and charged with duties which are popular and pleasing. Our trusts are of a different kind. Our duties are harsh and invidious in their nature, and justice and safety is all we can expect in the exercise of them. We are to offer salutary, which is not always pleasing, counsel. We are to inquire and to accuse, and the objects of our inquiry and charge will be for the most part persons of wealth, power, and extensive connections. We are to make rigid laws for the preservation of revenue, which of necessity more or less confine some action or restrain some function which before was free. What is the most critical and invidious of all, the whole body of the public impositions originate from us, and the hand of the House of Commons is seen and felt in every burden that presses on the people. Whilst ultimately we are serving them, and in the first instance whilst we are serving His Majesty, it will be hard indeed if we should see a House of Commons, the victim of its zeal and fidelity, sacrificed by his ministers to those very popular discontents which shall be excited by our dutiful endeavours for the security and greatness of his throne. No other consequence can result from such an example, but that, in future, the House of Commons, consulting its safety at the expense of its duties, and suffering the whole energy of the state to be relaxed, will shrink from every service which, however necessary, is of a great and arduous nature. All that, willing to provide for the public necessities, and at the same time to secure the means of performing that task, they will exchange independence for protection, and will court a subservient existence through the favour of those ministers of state, all those secret advisers who ought themselves to stand in awe of the commons of this realm. A House of Commons respected by his ministers is essential to His Majesty's service. It is fit that they should yield to Parliament, and not that Parliament should be new-modelled until it is fitted to their purposes. If our authority is only to be held up when we coincide in opinion with His Majesty's advisers, but is to be set at naught the moment it differs from them, the House of Commons will sink into a mere appendage of administration, and will lose that independent character which, inseparably connecting the honour and reputation with the acts of this House, enables us to afford a real, effective, and substantial support to his government. It is the deference shown to our opinion, when we dissent from the servants of the Crown, which alone can give authority to the proceedings of this House when it concurs with their measures. That authority once lost, the credit of His Majesty's Crown will be impaired in the eyes of all nations. Foreign powers, who may yet wish to revive a friendly intercourse with this nation, will look in vain for that hold which gave a connection with Great Britain the preference to an affiance with any other state. A House of Commons of which ministers were known to stand in awe, where everything was necessarily discussed on principles fit to be openly and publicly avowed, and which could not be retracted or varied without danger, furnished a ground of confidence in the public faith which the engagement of no state dependent on the fluctuation of personal favour and private advice can ever pretend to. If faith with the House of Commons, the grand security for the national faith itself, can be broken with impunity, a wound is given to the political importance of Great Britain which will not easily be healed. That there was a great variance between the late House of Commons and certain persons whom His Majesty has been advised to make and continue as ministers, in defiance of the advice of that House, is notorious to the world. That House did not confide in those ministers, and they withheld their confidence from them for reasons for which posterity will honour and respect the names of those who composed that House of Commons, distinguished for its independence. They could not confide in persons who have shown a disposition to dark and dangerous intrigues. By these intrigues they have weakened, if not destroyed, the clear assurance which His Majesty's people, and which all nations, ought to have of what are and what are not the real acts of his government. If it should be seen that his ministers may continue in their offices without any signification to them of his Majesty's displeasure at any of their measures, whilst persons considerable for their rank and known to have had access to his Majesty's sacred person, can with impunity abuse that advantage and employ his Majesty's name to disavow and counteract the proceedings of his official servants, nothing but distrust, discord, debility, contempt of all authority, and general confusion can prevail in his government. End of section 29. Section 30 of the works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 2. A representation to His Majesty, moved in the House of Commons, June 14th, 1784, Part 2. This we lay before His Majesty with humility and concern, as the inevitable effect of a spirit of intrigue in his executive government, an evil which we have but too much reason to be persuaded exists and increases. During the course of the last session, it broke out in a manner the most alarming. This evil was infinitely aggravated by the unauthorized, but not disavowed, use which has been made of His Majesty's name, for the purpose of the most unconstitutional, corrupt, and dishonourable influence on the minds of the members of Parliament that ever was practised in this kingdom. No attention even to exterior decorum in the practice of corruption and intimidation employed on peers was observed. Several peers were obliged under menaces to retract their declarations and to recall their proxies. The Commons have the deepest interest in the purity and integrity of the peerage. The peers dispose of all the property in the kingdom in the last resort, and they dispose of it on their honour and not on their oaths, as all the members of every other tribunal in the kingdom must do, though in them the proceeding is not conclusive. We have, therefore, a right to demand that no application shall be made to peers of such a nature as may give room to call in question, much less to attaint, our sole security for all that we possess. This corrupt proceeding appeared to the House of Commons, who are the natural guardians of the purity of Parliament and of the purity of every branch of judicature, a most reprehensible and dangerous practice, tending to shake the very foundation of the authority of the House of Peers, and they branded it as such by their resolution. The House had not sufficient evidence to enable them legally to punish this practice, but they had enough to caution them against all confidence in the authors and abettors of it. They performed their duty in humbly advising His Majesty against the employment of such ministers, but His Majesty was advised to keep those ministers and to dissolve that Parliament. The House, aware of the importance and urgency of its duty with regard to the British interests in India, which were and are in the utmost disorder and in the utmost peril, most humbly requested His Majesty not to dissolve the Parliament during the course of their very critical proceedings on that subject. His Majesty's gracious condescension to that request was conveyed in the royal faith, pledged to a House of Parliament, and solemnly delivered from the throne. It was but a very few days after a committee had been, with the consent and concurrence of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, appointed for an inquiry into certain accounts delivered to the House by the Court of Directors, and then actually engaged in that inquiry, that the ministers, regardless of the assurance given from the Crown to a House of Commons, did dissolve that Parliament. We most humbly submit to His Majesty's consideration the consequences of this their breach of public faith. Whilst the members of the House of Commons under that security were engaged in His Majesty's and the national business, endeavours were industriously used to calumniate those whom it was found impracticable to corrupt. The reputation of the members and the reputation of the House itself was undermined in every part of the kingdom. In the speech from the throne relative to India, we are cautioned by the ministers not to lose sight of the effect any measure may have on the constitution of our country. We are apprehensive that a calumnious report spread abroad of an attack upon His Majesty's prerogative by the late House of Commons may have made an impression on his royal mind and have given occasion to this unusual admonition to the present. This attack is charged to have been made in the late Parliament by a bill which passed the House of Commons in the late session of that Parliament for the regulation of the affairs, for the preservation of the commerce, and for the amendment of the government of this nation in the East Indies. That His Majesty and his people may have an opportunity of entering into the ground of this injurious charge, we beg leave humbly to acquaint His Majesty that far from having made any infringement whatsoever on any part of his royal prerogative, that bill did, for a limited time, give to His Majesty certain powers never before possessed by the Crown, and for this his present ministers, who, rather than fall short in the number of the calumnies, employ some that are contradictory, have slandered this House as aiming at the extension of an unconstitutional influence in His Majesty's Crown. This pretended attempt to increase the influence of the Crown they were weak enough to endeavour to persuade His Majesty's people was amongst the causes which excited His Majesty's resentment against his late ministers. Further, to remove the impressions of this calumny concerning an attempt in the House of Commons against his prerogative, it is proper to inform His Majesty that the territorial possessions in the East Indies never have been declared by any public judgment, act or instrument, or any resolution of Parliament whatsoever, to be the subject matter of His Majesty's prerogative, nor have they ever been understood as belonging to his ordinary administration, or to be annexed or united to his crown, but that they are acquisitions of a new and peculiar description, unknown to the ancient executive constitution of this country. From time to time, therefore, Parliament provided for their government according to its discretion, and to its opinion of what was required by the public necessities. We do not know that His Majesty was entitled, by prerogative, to exercise any active authority whatsoever in the company's affairs, or that, in effect, such authority has ever been exercised. His Majesty's patronage was not taken away by that bill, because it is notorious that His Majesty never originally had the appointment of a single officer, civil or military, in the company's establishment in India, nor has the least degree of patronage ever been acquired to the Crown in any other manner or measure than as the power was thought expedient to be granted by Act of Parliament. That is, by the very same authority by which the officers were disposed of and regulated in the bill which His Majesty's servants have falsely and injuriously represented as infringing upon the prerogative of the Crown. Before the year 1773, the whole administration of India and the whole patronage to office there was in the hands of the East India Company. The East India Company is not a branch of His Majesty's prerogative administration, nor does that body exercise any species of authority under it, nor indeed from any British title that does not derive all its legal validity from Acts of Parliament. When a claim was asserted to the India territorial possessions in the occupation of the company, these possessions were not claimed as parcel of His Majesty's patrimonial estate, or as a fruit of the ancient inheritance of his crown. They were claimed for the public. And when agreements were made with the East India Company concerning any composition for the holding or any participation of the profits of those territories, the agreement was made with the public, and the preambles of the several acts have uniformly so stated it. These agreements were not made even nominally with His Majesty, but with Parliament, and the bills making and establishing such agreements always originated in this House, which appropriated the money to await the disposition of Parliament without the ceremony of previous consent from the Crown, even so much as suggested by any of his ministers, which previous consent is an observance of decorum, not indeed of strict right, but generally paid when a new appropriation takes place in any part of His Majesty's prerogative revenues. In pursuance of a right thus uniformly recognised and uniformly acted on, when Parliament undertook the reformation of the East India Company in 1773, a commission was appointed, as the commission in the late bill was appointed, and it was made to continue for a term of years, as the commission in the late bill was to continue. All the commissioners were named in Parliament, as in the late bill they were named. As they received, so they held their offices, wholly independent of the Crown. They held them for a fixed term. They were not removable by an address of either House or even of both Houses of Parliament, a precaution observed in the late bill relative to the commissioners proposed therein. Nor were they bound by the strict rules of proceeding which regulated and restrained the late commissioners against all possible abuse of a power which could not fail of being diligently and zealously watched by the ministers of the Crown and the proprietors of the stock, as well as by Parliament. Their proceedings were, in that bill, directed to be of such a nature as easily to subject them to the strictest revision of both, in case of any malversation. In the year 1780, an Act of Parliament again made provision for the government of those territories for another 4 years, without any sort of reference to prerogative, nor was the least objection taken at the second more than at the first of those periods, as if an infringement had been made upon the rights of the Crown. Yet His Majesty's ministers have thought fit to represent the late commission as an entire innovation on the Constitution, and the setting up a new order and estate in the nation, tending to the subversion of the monarchy itself. If the government of the East Indies, other than by His Majesty's prerogative, be in effect a fourth order in the Commonwealth, this order has long existed, because the East India Company has for many years enjoyed it in the fullest extent, and does at this day enjoy the whole administration of those provinces, and the patronage to offices throughout that great empire, except as it is controlled by Act of Parliament. It was the ill condition and ill administration of the Company's affairs which induced this House, merely as a temporary establishment, to vest the same powers which the Company did before possess, and no other, for a limited time, and under very strict directions, in proper hands, until they could be restored, or farther provision made concerning them. It was therefore no creation whatever of a new power, but the removal of an old power, long since created, and then existing, from the management of those persons who had manifestly and dangerously abused their trust. This House, which well knows the parliamentary origin of all the Company's powers and privileges, and is not ignorant or negligent of the authority which may vest those powers and privileges in others, if justice and the public safety so require, is conscious to itself that it no more creates a new order in the state by making occasional trustees for the direction of the Company than it originally did in giving a much more permanent trust to the directors or to the general court of that body. The monopoly of the East India Company was a derogation from the general freedom of trade belonging to His Majesty's people. The powers of government and of peace and war are parts of prerogative of the highest order, of our competence to restrain the rights of all his subjects by Act of Parliament, and to vest those high and eminent prerogatives even in a particular company of merchants, there has been no question. We beg leave most humbly to claim as our right, and as a right which this House has always used, to frame such bills for the regulation of that commerce, and of the territories held by the East India Company, and everything relating to them, as to our discretion shall seem fit, and we assert and maintain that therein we follow, and do not innovate on, the Constitution. That His Majesty's ministers, misled by their ambition, have endeavoured, if possible, to form a faction in the country against the popular part of the Constitution, and have therefore thought proper to add to their slanderous accusation against a House of Parliament, relative to His Majesty's prerogative, another of a different nature, calculated for the purpose of raising fears and jealousies among the corporate bodies of the kingdom, and of persuading uninformed persons belonging to those corporations to look to and to make addresses to them as protectors of their rights under their several charters from the designs which they, without any ground, charged the House of Commons to have formed against charters in general. For this purpose, they have not scrupled to assert that the exertion of His Majesty's prerogative in the late precipitate change in his administration and the dissolution of the late Parliament were measures adopted in order to rescue the people and their rights out of the hands of the House of Commons, their representatives. We trust that His Majesty's subjects are not yet so far deluded as to believe that the charters, or that any other of their local or general privileges, can have a solid security in any place but where that security has always been looked for and always found, in the House of Commons. Miserable and precarious indeed would be the state of their franchises if they were to find no defence but from that quarter from whence they have always been attacked. But the late House of Commons, in passing that bill, made no attack upon any powers or privileges, except such as a House of Commons has frequently attacked and will attack, and they trust in the end with their wonted success, that is, upon those which are corruptly and oppressively administered. And this House do faithfully assure His Majesty that we will correct, and if necessary for the purpose, as far as in us lies, will wholly destroy every species of power and authority exercised by British subjects to the oppression, wrong, and detriment of the people, and to the impoverishment and desolation of the countries subject to it. The propagators of the calumnies against that House of Parliament have been indefatigable in exaggerating the supposed injury done to the East India Company by the suspension of the authorities which they have in every instance abused, as if power had been wrested by wrong and violence from just and prudent hands. But they have, with equal care, concealed the weighty grounds and reasons on which that House had adopted the most moderate of all possible expedients for rescuing the natives of India from oppression, and for saving the interests of the real and honest proprietors of their stock, as well as that great national commercial concern, from imminent ruin. The ministers aforesaid have also caused it to be reported that the House of Commons have confiscated the property of the East India Company. It is the reverse of truth. The whole management was a trust for the proprietors under their own inspection, and it was so provided for in the bill, and under the inspection of Parliament. That bill, so far from confiscating the company's property, was the only one which for several years past did not, in some shape or other, affect their property or restrain them in the disposition of it. It is proper that His Majesty and all his people should be informed that the House of Commons have proceeded, with regard to the East India Company, with a degree of care, circumspection, and deliberation which has not been equalled in the history of parliamentary proceedings. For 16 years, the state and condition of that body has never been wholly out of their view. In the year 1767, the House took those objects into consideration in a committee of the whole House. The business was pursued in the following year. In the year 1772, 2 committees were appointed for the same purpose, which examined into their affairs with much diligence and made very ample reports. In the year 1773, the proceedings were carried to an Act of Parliament which proved ineffectual to its purpose. The oppressions and abuses in India have since rather increased than diminished on account of the greatness of the temptations and convenience of the opportunities which got the better of the legislative provisions calculated against ill practices than in their beginnings, insomuch that in 1781 2 committees were again instituted, who have made 17 reports. It was upon the most minute, exact, and laborious collection and discussion of facts that the late House of Commons proceeded in the reform which they attempted in the administration of India, but which has been frustrated by ways and means the most dishonourable to His Majesty's government and the most pernicious to the constitution of this kingdom. His Majesty was so sensible of the disorders in the company's administration that the consideration of that subject was no less than 6 times recommended to this House in speeches from the throne. The result of the parliamentary inquiries has been that the East India Company was found totally corrupted and totally perverted from the purposes of its institution, whether political or commercial, that the powers of war and peace given by the Charter had been abused by kindling hostilities in every quarter for the purposes of rapine, that almost all the treaties of peace they have made have only given cause to so many breaches of public faith, that countries, once the most flourishing, are reduced to a state of indigence, decay, and depopulation, to the diminution of our strength, and to the infinite dishonour of our national character, that the laws of this kingdom are notoriously and almost in every instance despised, that the servants of the company, by the purchase of qualifications to vote in the general court, and at length by getting the company itself deeply in their debt, have obtained the entire and absolute mastery in the body by which they ought to have been ruled and coerced. Thus their malversations in office are supported instead of being checked by the company. The whole of the affairs of that body are reduced to a most perilous situation, and many millions of innocent and deserving men, who are under the protection of this nation, and who ought to be protected by it, are oppressed by a most despotic and rapacious tyranny. The company and their servants have strengthened themselves by this confederacy, set at defiance the authority and admonitions of this House employed to reform them, and when this House has selected certain principal delinquents whom they declared it the duty of the company to recall, the company held out its legal privileges against all reformation, positively refused to recall them, and supported those who had fallen under the just censure of this House with new and stronger marks of countenance and approbation. The late House, discovering the reversed situation of the company, by which the nominal servants are really the masters, and the offenders are become their own judges, thought fit to examine into the state of their commerce, and they have also discovered that their commercial affairs are in the greatest disorder, that their debts have accumulated beyond any present or obvious future means of payment, at least under the actual administration of their affairs, that this condition of the East India Company has begun to affect the sinking fund itself, on which the public credit of the kingdom rests, 1 million and upwards being due to the customs, which that House of Commons, whose intentions towards the company have been so grossly misrepresented, were indulgent enough to respite. And thus, instead of confiscating their property, the company received without interest, which in such a case had been before charged, the use of a very large sum of the public money. The revenues are under the peculiar care of this House, not only as the revenues originate from us, but as, on every failure if the funds set apart for the support of the national credit, or to provide for the national strength and safety, the task of supplying every deficiency falls upon His Majesty's faithful Commons. This House must, in effect, tax the people. The House, therefore, at every moment, incurs the hazard of becoming obnoxious to its constituents. The enemies of the late House of Commons resolved, if possible, to bring on that event. They therefore endeavoured to misrepresent the provident means adopted by the House of Commons for keeping off this invidious necessity, as an attack on the rights of the East India Company. For they well knew that, on the one hand, if for want of proper regulation and relief, the company should become insolvent or even stop payment, the national credit and commerce would sustain a heavy blow, and that calamity would be justly imputed to Parliament, which after such long inquiries and such frequent admonitions from His Majesty, had neglected so essential and so urgent an article of their duty. On the other hand, they knew that, wholly corrupted as the company is, nothing effectual could be done to preserve that interest from ruin, without taking for a time the national objects of their trust out of their hands, and then a cry would be industriously raised against the House of Commons as depriving British subjects of their legal privileges. The restraint, being plain and simple, must be easily understood by those who would be brought with great difficulty to comprehend the intricate detail of matters of fact which rendered this suspension of the administration of India absolutely necessary on motives of justice, of policy, of public honour and public safety. The House of Commons had not been able to devise a method by which the redress of grievances could be effected through the authors of those grievances, nor could they imagine how corruptions could be purified by the corrupters and the corrupted. Nor do we now conceive how any reformation can proceed from the known abettors and supporters of the persons who have been guilty of the misdemeanours which Parliament has reprobated, and who for their own ill purposes have given countenance to a false and delusive state of the company's affairs, fabricated to mislead Parliament and to impose upon the nation. Your Commons feel, with a just resentment, the inadequate estimate which your ministers have formed of the importance of this great concern. They call on us to act upon the principles of those who have not inquired into the subject, and to condemn those who with the most laudable diligence have examined and scrutinized every part of it. The deliberations of Parliament have been broken. The season of the year is unfavourable. Many of us are new members, who must be wholly unacquainted with the subject, which lies remote from the ordinary course of general information. We are cautioned against an infringement of the Constitution, and it is impossible to know what the secret advisers of the Crown, who have driven out the late ministers for their conduct in Parliament, and have dissolved the late Parliament for a pretended attack upon prerogative, will consider as such an infringement. We are not furnished with a rule, the observance of which can make us safe from the resentment of the Crown, even by an implicit obedience to the dictates of the ministers who have advised that speech. We know not how soon those ministers may be disavowed, and how soon the members of this House, for our very agreement with them, may be considered as objects of His Majesty's displeasure. Until by His Majesty's goodness and wisdom the late example is completely done away, we are not free. We are well aware, in providing for the affairs of the East, with what an adult strength of abuse and of wealth and influence growing out of that abuse His Majesty's Commons had in the last Parliament and still have to struggle. We are sensible that the influence of that wealth, in a much larger degree and measure than at any former period, may have penetrated into the very quarter from whence alone any real reformation can be expected. If, therefore, in the arduous affairs recommended to us, our proceedings should be ill-adapted, feeble and ineffectual, if no delinquency should be prevented, and no delinquent should be called to account, if every person should be caressed, promoted, and raised in power in proportion to the enormity of his offences, if no relief should be given to any of the natives unjustly dispossessed of their rights, jurisdictions, and properties, if no cruel and unjust exactions should be forborne, if the source of no peculation or oppressive gain should be cut off, if, by the omission of the opportunities that were in our hands, our Indian Empire should fall into ruin irretrievable, and in its fall crush the credit and overwhelm the revenues of this country, we stand acquitted to our honour and to our conscience, who have reluctantly seen the weightiest interests of our country, at times the most critical to its dignity and safety, rendered the sport of the inconsiderate and unmeasured ambition of individuals, and by that means the wisdom of His Majesty's government degraded in the public estimation, and the policy and character of this renowned nation rendered contemptible in the eyes of all Europe. End of section 30. End of the works of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, Volume 2.